Lucas had always been curious, perhaps too much for his own good. The road he traveled was rarely used, a forgotten stretch of asphalt that led to nowhere, or so he thought. As dusk began to settle, the silhouette of an old factory emerged from the thickening fog. The structure loomed in the distance, its jagged edges cutting through the fading light like the teeth of some great, rusting beast. It was the old steel mill, abandoned for decades after a tragic accident that had sealed its fate in local legend. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew the stories. Stories of ghostly figures, of strange sounds in the night, of something that still lingered in the hollowed-out shell of industry. As Lucas approached the gates, a wave of unease swept over him. The air felt wrong, heavy, thick, as if it were carrying the weight of years of untold stories. The massive iron doors, once strong and unyielding, now stood slightly ajar, inviting him in like the maw of some forgotten monster. Despite the primal voice in his head warning him to turn back, Lucas felt drawn to the place. His heart pounded as he stepped inside. The world outside felt distant, like a dream he could barely remember. Here, in this place, time seemed to stand still, as if the mill itself existed in a dimension separate from reality. The interior was a labyrinth of rusting machines, corroded beams, and crumbling walls. The once mighty furnaces were now silent, their gaping mouths yawning into the blackness. Yet, as Lucas ventured deeper, he could swear he heard something, a faint clanging, like the distant echo of hammers striking steel. He froze, listening. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't his imagination. Someone, or something, was in there with him. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow, as he moved toward the source of the noise. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown, a descent into madness. The shadows seemed to twist and move on their own, elongating in unnatural ways. The dim light from his flashlight flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the sound of metal screeching against metal pierced the silence. Lucas spun around, his light catching a glimpse of something darting past, a shape too fast to comprehend, vanishing into the darkness. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. This was insane. The stories about the steel mill were just that, stories. But as the shadows around him seemed to thicken, growing denser with each passing moment, he began to doubt. The further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, each breath turning into a visible puff of mist. His skin prickled with an unseen presence. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, like the shuffle of boots on concrete, but growing louder, more deliberate. They weren't his. Lucas whipped around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. And then, as if from the very walls themselves, came a voice. Low, almost a whisper, but unmistakably there. It called his name. Terror surged through him. How could anyone know his name? He hadn't told anyone where he was going. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the mill itself had rooted him to the spot. The shadows seemed to close in around him, suffocating, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, faint but unmistakable, standing in the doorway of one of the old offices. It was dressed in the uniform of a steelworker, but its face was wrong. Where its features should have been, there was nothing but a blank, smooth surface, like a mannequin. And then it moved, stepping out into the hallway, its footsteps echoing in the stillness. Lucas's flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling against the oppressive darkness. And when the light steadied, the figure was gone. Panic set in. He needed to get out, now. But as Lucas turned to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of machinery grinding to life. One of the massive furnaces, dormant for decades, suddenly roared with energy. The heat radiating from it was palpable, burning through the cold that had gripped him moments before. But no one was there to tend it. No human hand had sparked it to life. And yet, the machinery was running, as if the ghosts of the past had resumed their work. The clanging of hammers on steel grew louder, more frenzied. It wasn't an echo, it was happening now. Heart pounding in his chest, Lucas sprinted toward the exit, but the shadows seemed to twist and distort the path before him. The once open door now appeared far too distant, the mill warping his sense of direction. The sound of boots behind him quickened, and for the first time, Lucas understood. He wasn't just being watched. He was being hunted. As he reached the doorway, a freezing hand grasped his shoulder, yanking him back with an inhuman strength. He stumbled, flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the outline of another figure, this one standing at the far end of the hall, its blank face turned toward him, as if waiting for him to make the next move. In the suffocating silence that followed, the sound of a hammer striking steel echoed one last time. Lucas had barely caught his breath from the encounter when he noticed something peculiar. His flashlight beam, weak and flickering, danced across the rusted remains of old machinery, casting elongated shadows that seemed to pulse with life. But there, among the corroded iron and twisted steel, was something out of place. A small, dusty object caught his eye, half buried beneath a layer of debris. Kneeling down, his heart pounding in his chest, Lucas brushed away the grime to reveal an old, battered toy, a miniature iron truck, its paint long faded, its wheels frozen in place by decades of neglect. The sight of it sent a jolt through him, like an electric current surging up his spine. This wasn't just any toy, it was his. He recognized it instantly, the same one he had played with as a child, back when his grandfather used to tell him stories of the mill. Lucas had spent countless hours pushing that little truck around in his grandfather's yard, pretending it was part of the mill's fleet. But how could it be here, in this place? He hadn't seen it in years. The last time he remembered holding it was the day his grandfather died, a day that was seared into his memory, though much of it was clouded by a child's grief. His hands trembled as he held the truck, the metal cold against his skin despite the suffocating heat now radiating from the mill. Memories long buried began to surface, fragments of moments he had tried to forget. He remembered standing at the edge of his grandfather's casket, staring at the old man's peaceful face, hearing the muffled sobs of relatives behind him. But there was something else, something he had never fully understood until now. That day during the funeral, his grandfather had whispered something to him, words no one else had heard, because they hadn't come from his lips. They had come from the shadows. Lucas felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the realization hit. He hadn't imagined it. The stories his grandfather told him about the steel mill, about the workers who vanished, about the strange noises at night, they weren't just ghost stories. They were warnings. And now, standing in the heart of the very place his grandfather had feared, Lucas could hear it again. That same whisper, faint but unmistakable, brushing against the edge of his consciousness. The voice was his grandfather's, but twisted, distorted, as though it were being pulled from some dark, forgotten place. He stood up quickly, the toy truck still clutched in his hand, his pulse racing. The air around him seemed to shift, thickening with an unseen force. The walls of the mill creaked and groaned, as if they were alive, straining under the weight of some invisible burden. And then, just at the edge of his hearing, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward him from the shadows. Lucas's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. He had always thought his grandfather's stories were just that, stories, meant to scare a young boy and keep him from wandering into dangerous places. But now, it was all too real. His grandfather had worked here, in this very mill, before the accident that had shut it down. But there was something his family had never told him, something that even now, in the oppressive silence of the mill, was clawing its way to the surface of his mind. As the footsteps grew closer, Lucas turned, expecting to see one of the faceless figures from before. But there was nothing, just the endless maze of rusted machinery and decaying walls. Yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He could feel eyes on him, cold and calculating, as though something was studying him from the darkness. His grip tightened on the toy truck, the familiar object now offering little comfort. And then he saw it, etched into the metal of one of the support beams, half hidden by years of grime, was a name. His grandfather's name. Lucas's heart skipped a beat as he moved closer, wiping away the dirt with trembling fingers. Below the name was a date, the day his grandfather had died. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and for a moment, Lucas felt as though the entire building was about to collapse, dragging him down into some forgotten abyss. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't coming from his grandfather. They were coming from the mill itself, as if the very structure was alive with the voices of the dead. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked down to see a thin line of blood trickling from his palm, where the toy truck had cut into his skin. But it wasn't the wound that terrified him. It was the fact that the truck had moved. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as he stared at it, he realized that the wheels, which had been rusted and immobile for years, were slowly turning on their own. Panic surged through him. He dropped the truck, watching in horror as it rolled a few feet across the floor, coming to a stop near the base of the support beam. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever force was controlling the mill was growing impatient. And then, as if in answer to some unspoken command, the machinery around him began to stir. The grinding of gears, the clanging of metal. It was as though the entire mill had come back to life, but not in any natural way. Lucas stumbled backward, his mind spinning. He had to get out, had to leave before whatever presence haunted this place claimed him as its next victim. But as he turned to run, a sudden, chilling thought crossed his mind. His grandfather's death. It wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. The mill had taken him, just as it had taken the others. And now it wanted Lucas too. The past, long buried and forgotten, had come back to claim him. Lucas's mind raced as the strange machinery of the mill whirred to life around him. The rusted gears groaned and clanged in the suffocating darkness, filling the air with a cacophony that vibrated through his bones. The whispers, growing louder, more urgent, swirled in his ears like a rising storm. It was as if the very walls were speaking, calling him toward a decision he was not prepared to make. His hands trembled, slick with sweat, as he clutched the toy truck, now slick with his own blood, tight against his chest, an anchor to the nightmare he was living. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and the oppressive weight of the unseen force pressed down on him from all sides. Then, from the shadows, it emerged, a figure, barely more than a silhouette in the dim flicker of his failing flashlight. It stood unnaturally still, its blank face turned toward Lucas as if it could see straight through him. A sense of primal dread clawed at his insides. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. This was the force that had devoured his grandfather, the entity that had claimed the lives of so many who had worked in the mill. And now, it wanted him. In that moment, Lucas knew this was not just a place of torment. It was a prison, and the figure before him was both its warden and its prisoner. The thing, whatever it was, did not speak in words. Its voice, cold and invasive, slithered into his mind like the hiss of steam escaping a broken pipe. "You must choose," it whispered, though its lips never moved. "The debt must be paid." The toy truck in his hands began to grow warm, almost burning, as if it were alive with the weight of the decision he was about to face. He looked down at it, and in his mind's eye, he saw his grandfather's face, clear as day, smiling down at him from a memory long buried. It was a peaceful image, one filled with the love and safety of a childhood spent in the old man's care. But there was something else there, something darker that he had always ignored. A flicker of fear in his grandfather's eyes, something unspoken that had haunted the old man until his dying breath. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figure stepped closer, its very presence warping the air around it. Lucas felt the crushing weight of the decision being forced upon him. He had two choices, neither of them good, neither of them easy. The entity offered him a cruel bargain. He could sacrifice one of his most cherished memories, the last true, untainted piece of his grandfather, to appease the mill's insatiable hunger. If he did, he could leave this place, but the memory would be gone forever, erased from his mind as if it had never existed. His grandfather's face, his voice, his stories, they would all disappear into the void, leaving nothing but a blank space where the love and warmth had once been. Or Lucas could choose to absorb part of the entity's darkness. By doing so, he would trap the malevolent force inside him, becoming its living prison. He would carry the burden for the rest of his life, knowing that the mill's curse had not been broken, only transferred. It would eat away at him, slowly consuming his mind, his soul, until he became something less than human. But in doing so, he could keep his memories intact. He could still hold on to the love of his grandfather, though it would be forever tainted by the darkness he would carry inside him. The weight of the decision crushed him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhale like drawing in shards of glass. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, to flee from the nightmare that surrounded him, but he knew that was impossible. The mill would never let him go without a price. Tears welled in his eyes as he glanced down at the toy truck in his hands, his vision blurring with grief. How could he choose? How could he erase the memory of the one person who had ever truly loved him? But how could he live with the darkness inside him, knowing that every day it would twist him, corrupt him, until there was nothing left but an empty shell? The figure moved closer still, its faceless gaze boring into him. The choice hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Lucas's mind screamed with the unfairness of it all. He didn't want to lose the last piece of his grandfather, didn't want to carry the darkness, but he had no choice. Either way, a part of him would be lost forever. In the oppressive silence, the only sound was his own ragged breathing and the slow, mechanical clanking of the mill's machinery, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for his answer. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him forward, its whispering voice a cold blade against his mind. Choose, Lucas. The debt must be paid. His chest tightened, and the tears finally spilled down his face. Slowly, almost involuntarily, his hand extended, the toy truck trembling in his grasp. His mind raced as he weighed the impossible decision. The memory of his grandfather's smile flickered in his mind one last time, fragile and precious. And then, with a trembling voice barely louder than a breath, he spoke. His choice made, Lucas felt the weight of his decision crash down on him, heavy as a tombstone. The mill seemed to pulse with satisfaction, the machinery around him slowing to a dull, rhythmic hum. The darkness crept closer, ready to consume him, or the precious memory he was willing to sacrifice. The figure faded back into the shadows, leaving Lucas alone in the cold, suffocating dark. His choice had been made, but the consequences had only just begun. The silence after Lucas's choice was deafening. The relentless hum of machinery that had haunted his every step within the steel mill had ceased, leaving a stillness that was almost more terrifying than the noise. The air felt wrong, dense and heavy, as if it had become thicker, more oppressive, with the weight of something unseen. The darkness that clung to the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching unnaturally toward him, as if it were alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucas stood frozen, his mind reeling from the decision he had just made. His breath came in shallow gasps as the full weight of his choice settled over him. The faint whispers that had been plaguing him since his arrival at the mill began again, growing louder now, more distinct. They weren't just sounds carried on the wind. They were voices, murmuring just beyond the edge of his understanding, speaking in a language he couldn't comprehend but instinctively feared. As Lucas's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, jittery shadows across the rusted walls, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His skin prickled with an unnatural chill, a cold that seemed to seep from the very floor beneath him. He knew something was there, lurking just out of sight, hidden within the folds of the mill's decaying structure. His mind told him it was impossible, that there was no one left in this forsaken place, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Whatever had been haunting this mill for all these years was still here, and had set its sights on him. Suddenly, from the far corner of the room, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a faint shuffling, like the slow, deliberate movement of something dragging itself across the ground. Lucas's heart thundered in his chest as he turned, his flashlight beam swinging wildly in the direction of the noise. The light revealed nothing but twisted beams of iron and crumbling machinery, yet the sense of a presence was unmistakable. Something was hiding in the shadows, and it was getting closer. His pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding him, pressing in on his mind like a vice. The words, though incomprehensible, carried a weight that chilled him to the core, as though they were laced with ancient malice, older than the steel mill itself. The shadows, once content to linger at the edges of the room, now seemed to creep toward him with unnatural speed, moving like liquid darkness, devouring the light as they closed in around him. Lucas's flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as if it were fighting against the encroaching blackness. His hands trembled, his breath shallow and rapid. Panic clawed at his insides, urging him to run, but his legs felt leaden, rooted to the spot as though the very floor beneath him had come alive and was holding him captive. The cold air tightened around him, and with it came a voice, a whisper, distinct this time, yet barely audible, like a breath on the back of his neck. Lucas. The voice was unmistakable, though warped and distorted by something inhuman. It was his grandfather's voice, but it carried with it a darkness, an emptiness that chilled him to the bone. He whipped around, the flashlight beam casting a feeble glow in the direction of the voice. The shadows parted briefly, and for the briefest of moments he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the old uniform of a mill worker. But something was horribly wrong. Where the figure's face should have been, there was only a hollow void, a darkness deeper than the shadows that surrounded it. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were dragging itself from the very depths of the earth. Lucas stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor, its weak beam now casting eerie shapes on the walls. The room was now almost completely swallowed by shadow, the figure drawing ever closer, its presence filling the space with a suffocating sense of dread. Lucas scrambled to retrieve his flashlight, his fingers fumbling in the cold darkness. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder, more urgent. He could feel the presence of the figure looming over him, its breath, cold and unnatural, brushing against his skin like a frigid wind. His heart raced, his thoughts a frantic blur of fear and confusion. The mill, the shadows, the voices, they were all connected, all part of something much larger and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. As his fingers closed around the flashlight, Lucas managed to point its beam upward, illuminating the space in front of him. The figure was gone. The room was empty once more, but the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger now, more invasive. It wasn't just the mill that was haunted. It was him. Whatever malevolent force had taken root here had latched onto him, feeding off his fear, his regret. The shadows had become more than just an absence of light. They were alive, sentient, and they were hunting him. Then came the sound, a low, deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the mill. It was as though the building itself was waking up, stirring from its long slumber. The machinery around him began to groan and shudder, gears grinding against metal as though they were being forced into motion by some unseen hand. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison, their words a twisted, nightmarish chant. Lucas knew he had to move, had to escape before the darkness consumed him entirely. But as he turned to run, the shadows shifted again, forming a solid wall in front of him, blocking his path. He was trapped, surrounded on all sides by the living darkness, the whispers now pounding in his skull like a relentless drumbeat. With no other choice, Lucas did the only thing he could. He ran into the shadows, plunging headfirst into the unknown, his mind racing with terror and desperation. The darkness swallowed him whole, and as he disappeared into the void, the last thing he heard was the whispering voice of his grandfather, calling his name one final time before everything went black. Lucas ran, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum, the oppressive darkness of the mill pressing in on him from every angle. He could no longer tell where he was or how far he had gone. The labyrinth of rusted steel and decaying walls seemed to stretch endlessly, each corridor identical to the last, as if the mill were reshaping itself to keep him trapped. But it wasn't just the physical space that was warping, it was his mind. The shadows that clung to the corners of his vision now seemed alive, twisting and stretching unnaturally, as if they were reaching for him, waiting for a moment of weakness. The whispers had not stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more insidious, winding their way into the deepest corners of his consciousness. They weren't just noises in the air anymore. They were inside his head, feeding on his thoughts, his memories, and most terrifyingly, his fears. Each step he took seemed to pull him deeper into the grip of the unknown, the line between reality and nightmare blurring with each passing moment. And then the visions began. At first, they were fleeting, like flashes of lightning in the corner of his eye. A shadow moving where there should be none. A face, his grandfather's face, appearing for just an instant in the reflection of a broken window, twisted and gaunt, before vanishing into the dark. But as Lucas moved deeper into the mill, the visions became clearer, more visceral. His surroundings seemed to change with every blink, every breath. One moment, he was running through a narrow, rusted hallway. The next, he was back in his childhood home, standing in his grandfather's kitchen, the smell of oil and metal heavy in the air. But there was something wrong. The house was too quiet, too still, as though time itself had frozen. And then, out of the silence, came the whisper again. Lucas. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening. There in the doorway stood his grandfather, or at least something that looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and empty, as if life had long since drained from him. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were distorted, like a radio stuck between stations. The sight of him twisted something deep inside Lucas, a pang of dread and longing mixed with an overwhelming sense of loss. But it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Lucas closed his eyes, willing the vision to disappear, to break free of the illusion that had wrapped itself around him like a vice. When he opened them again, the kitchen was gone, replaced once more by the cold, decaying walls of the mill. But the dread remained. His mind was playing tricks on him, distorting his sense of reality. Or maybe it wasn't his mind at all. Maybe the mill, the darkness, the entity. It was using his memories, his emotions, against him. It was toying with him, showing him what he wanted most, and twisting it into something terrifying. The whispers returned, louder now, more demanding. They no longer spoke his name. They spoke of his fears, his deepest, most hidden terrors. His fear of being forgotten, of losing the people he loved, his fear of death, of the void that awaited him on the other side. They whispered of regret, of mistakes made and paths not taken. And with every word, Lucas felt the ground beneath him give way just a little more, his grip on reality slipping as the voices promised escape, if only he would give in to the fear. The visions intensified. Now everywhere he looked, he saw the faces of those he had lost, staring at him from the darkness. His grandfather, his childhood friends, people he hadn't thought of in years. But their faces were wrong, distorted, twisted by something he couldn't understand. Their eyes were black, their mouths stretched into unnatural smiles. And they all whispered the same thing: stay. The temptation was overwhelming. Lucas could feel it pulling at him, a dark, seductive force that promised an end to the terror, an end to the suffering. All he had to do was stop running. All he had to do was let the darkness take him. The voices whispered that the fear would stop, that the pain would fade away, that he could rest, that he could stay with his grandfather forever. But deep down, Lucas knew it was a lie. The fear was a trap, a prison built to ensnare him, to feed on his soul. The mill had claimed so many before him, his grandfather, the workers, the countless souls who had vanished within its walls. And now it wanted him. It wanted to devour his mind, his memories, and leave nothing but an empty shell, just like it had done to the others. But the fear was so strong. It pressed against him from all sides, its cold fingers wrapping around his heart, squeezing until he could barely breathe. The whispers promised release, peace, but Lucas knew that peace would never come. If he gave in now, if he let the fear consume him, he would be lost forever. Suddenly, the walls around him began to shift, the metal creaking and groaning as the shadows moved with unnatural speed. The darkness surged toward him like a living thing, a tidal wave of shadow and whispers. Lucas stumbled backward, his mind screaming for him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The temptation of fear had rooted him to the spot, its cold tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the abyss. And then, in the distance, he heard it, a faint, familiar sound, cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. It was the sound of a hammer striking steel, the rhythmic clang echoing through the mill. For a moment, the whispers faltered, the shadows hesitating as if the sound had disrupted their hold on him. Lucas's heart raced. The sound was real. It was outside the illusion, outside the nightmare that had gripped him. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Lucas forced himself to move. He broke free from the cold grip of the shadows, running toward the sound of the hammer, the only anchor he had in the nightmare that threatened to consume him. The whispers screamed in protest, their voices growing louder, more desperate, but Lucas pushed on, his eyes locked on the faint glimmer of light ahead. As he ran, the shadows clawed at him, tearing at his clothes, his skin. But he didn't stop. He wouldn't give in. He wouldn't let the fear take him. The light grew closer, brighter, and as Lucas burst through the darkness, the whispers fell silent. He had escaped, for now, but the fear lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to strike. Lucas stumbled through the mill, gasping for breath, as the oppressive darkness seemed to retreat, if only momentarily. His body trembled with exhaustion, the cold sweat of fear clinging to his skin. The hammering sound that had guided him this far still echoed faintly, but it was distant now, like a beacon on the edge of oblivion. He could sense that the mill had let him escape for the moment, but it wasn't over. The darkness, the malevolent force that had twisted this place, was not finished with him. It was waiting for the final confrontation. As he pressed on through the decaying corridors, the whispers began again, faint at first, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. But there was a change in them now. They weren't just calling his name, weren't just feeding on his fear. They were revealing something. Slowly, piece by piece, a truth long buried began to rise to the surface, and with it, a realization that sent a chill through Lucas's bones. This wasn't just about the mill, or the workers who had died here. It was about him. The memories came flooding back. His grandfather's warnings, the stories he had told as a child about the cursed mill. But there had been something Lucas had forgotten, something crucial. His grandfather had not merely been a worker here. He had been part of something darker, something terrible. Lucas's mind swirled as fragmented memories took shape, piecing together the truth. His grandfather had been involved in a ritual, one that had bound the darkness to the mill. It had been a desperate attempt to control the malevolent force, but instead, it had created a prison. The mill had become a vessel for the darkness, trapping it, but also feeding it. And Lucas, as his grandson, was the key to releasing it. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. The entity had been waiting for him all along, using the mill's tortured spirits to lure him in. His grandfather's actions had tethered Lucas to this place, and now, the darkness sought to fulfill the pact that had been made decades ago. His bloodline, his very existence, was tied to this curse, and unless Lucas could find a way to break it, the entity would consume him, just as it had consumed his grandfather. Suddenly, the walls around him groaned, the metal warping and twisting as if the mill itself was alive, reacting to the truth Lucas had uncovered. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they sensed the moment was drawing near. The shadows thickened, crawling up the walls, seeping into every crack and crevice, until the entire space was enveloped in a suffocating darkness. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he realized he had reached the heart of the mill, the very source of its power. Before him stood the central furnace, an ancient, monstrous thing that loomed over the room like a dark god. Its gaping maw was blackened with soot, the remnants of the fire that had once fueled the mill's endless production. But now it was cold dead. Yet as Lucas stared into its depths, he could feel something stirring within it, something alive, something waiting. And then the shadows parted, revealing the figure that had haunted him from the moment he stepped foot in the mill. It was his grandfather, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and gaunt, his face a hollow mask of despair. But his eyes, those eyes were alive with the same malevolent force that had consumed the mill. He stood motionless at the edge of the furnace, watching Lucas with an empty, soul-draining gaze. "You came," the figure rasped, its voice a ghastly echo of his grandfather's. "I knew you would." Lucas's throat tightened as the realization set in. This was no reunion. This was a reckoning. "You have to finish it, Lucas," the figure continued, its voice filled with an eerie calm. "You have to pay the price." Lucas stepped back, his mind racing. The darkness around him began to close in, the shadows writhing like a living entity, ready to consume him at any moment. He could feel the weight of the mill pressing down on him, the suffocating presence of the malevolent force that had claimed this place. But now it was no longer just an abstract terror. It was personal. It had waited for him, fed on his fear, manipulated his memories, and now it wanted to take him as it had taken his grandfather. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices mingling with the figure's hollow words. Lucas's pulse quickened as the choices before him crystallized in his mind. He could submit, give himself over to the darkness, fulfill the cursed pact that had bound his family to this place. If he did, the entity would be released, free to roam the world beyond the mill's decaying walls, and Lucas would be lost, a vessel for the malevolence that had claimed so many before him. Or he could fight. He could defy the entity, break the curse, and destroy the darkness that had plagued his family for generations. But to do so would mean confronting the deepest fears within himself, facing the twisted remnants of his grandfather's soul and the full wrath of the mill's ancient evil. It would mean risking everything, his sanity, his life, and perhaps even his soul. The figure before him took a step closer, its gaunt hand outstretched, the shadows swirling around it like a living shroud. "It's your destiny, Lucas. There's no escape. You were always meant to be part of this." Lucas's heart raced as the darkness pressed in, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, screaming for him to submit, to give in to the fear, to let the shadows take him. But deep inside, a spark of defiance flickered to life. He wasn't like his grandfather. He wouldn't let the mill take him. Not without a fight. With a surge of adrenaline, Lucas lunged forward, toward the furnace. His hands trembling, he grabbed the ancient levers that had once fed the fire within. The shadows roared in fury, the whispers becoming shrieks of anger as the furnace sputtered to life, its cold depths igniting with a blaze of blinding heat. The figure of his grandfather recoiled, its form flickering and twisting as the light of the fire banished the darkness. "No," the figure howled, its voice distorted and inhuman. "You can't stop it." But Lucas was no longer listening. He pulled the levers with all his strength, the furnace roaring to life, flames licking at the walls of the mill as the ancient machinery groaned and shuddered. The darkness writhed in agony, the shadows recoiling from the light, and for the first time, Lucas felt the grip of the mill's malevolence weaken. The whispers faded, replaced by the deafening roar of the fire. The figure of his grandfather screamed, its body consumed by the light, dissolving into the shadows that had once controlled it. And as the flames surged higher, Lucas knew the moment of truth had come. He had broken the curse. But as the mill around him crumbled and the darkness receded, Lucas realized the price had been steep. His grandfather was gone, the truth of their connection lost to the flames. And though the entity had been defeated, Lucas could still feel its presence lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting for another chance. The darkness, after all, was never truly gone. The roar of the furnace faded, leaving only the crackling of fire and the groaning of the steel mill as it shuddered under the strain of its own dark history. Lucas stood at the center of it all, his body trembling with the adrenaline that still surged through him. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the shadows that had once seemed invincible now flickered weakly at the edges of the room, shrinking from the light of the fire. But Lucas knew better than to feel relief. The darkness had retreated, but it hadn't been defeated. Not yet. He could feel it, just beyond the reach of the flames, hiding in the deepest corners of the mill, watching him. It was still there, the malevolent force that had consumed this place, and the souls trapped within it. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It was only waiting for the right moment to strike. The furnace had bought him time, but not much. The final confrontation was coming, and Lucas knew it would be the most dangerous battle yet. As he stood there, catching his breath, the ground beneath him trembled. A low, deep rumble echoed through the mill, the sound reverberating through the steel beams and walls like the growl of a slumbering beast. Lucas's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. The mill itself was awakening. The shadows that had retreated were gathering once more, coalescing into something larger, more powerful. The darkness had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Lucas to make his move, to light the furnace, to try to break the curse. Now it was ready to strike back. The rumble grew louder, and suddenly, the walls around him began to bend and twist, the metal warping as if it were alive. The shadows surged forward, no longer content to lurk in the corners. They moved with purpose, swirling together like a living storm, gathering strength with each passing second. Lucas felt the temperature drop sharply, the warmth of the fire no longer enough to keep the cold at bay. His breath came out in visible puffs as the air around him froze, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, from the heart of the storm, it emerged. The entity, no longer just a whisper or a flicker in the shadows, took form before his eyes. It was a figure of pure darkness, towering over him, its shape constantly shifting and twisting like smoke in the wind. Its face was a void, a blackness so deep it seemed to devour the light around it. And yet, Lucas could feel its gaze on him, cold and malevolent. It was the embodiment of everything that had haunted the mill, the deaths, the tragedies, the cursed pact that had bound his family to this place. Lucas stood frozen, his body paralyzed by fear. The entity moved closer, its form rippling with power, the air around it crackling with an unnatural energy. The shadows writhed at its feet like serpents, reaching out for him, hungry for his soul. He could hear the whispers again, louder than ever, but this time they weren't just in his mind. They were all around him, a cacophony of voices, each one filled with hate, despair, and a deep, insatiable hunger. "You cannot escape," the entity whispered, its voice a low growl that seemed to come from the very bones of the mill. "You were always meant to be mine." Lucas's mind raced. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. The mill had sealed his fate the moment he stepped inside, and now there was no turning back. The entity was too powerful, too deeply entrenched in this place to be defeated by fire alone. But then he remembered something his grandfather had said. Buried in the fragments of memory, the mill had twisted and manipulated. The curse had been created by a ritual that had bound the entity to the mill, but also one that could be undone. The furnace, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of the ritual, but there was something more, something Lucas had overlooked. The toy truck. It had been there all along, a relic of his past, a connection to his grandfather, to the pact that had been made. It was the key. As the entity loomed over him, Lucas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, rusted metal of the toy truck. He pulled out, holding it in his trembling hand, and for a moment, the shadows recoiled. The entity hissed, its form flickering with rage as it recognized the object. This was the link, the final piece of the puzzle. His grandfather had sacrificed himself to trap the entity, but Lucas realized now that the toy had been more than just a memento. It had been imbued with part of the curse, a vessel that could both bind and release the darkness. "You can't win," the entity snarled, its voice filled with fury as it surged forward. The shadows lashed out, striking at Lucas like tendrils of smoke and ice. But he held his ground. The toy truck glowed faintly in his hand, the metal growing warm as it responded to the darkness, feeding on the energy around it. Lucas gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he tried to remember the fragments of the ritual. It had been passed down, hidden in the stories his grandfather told, disguised as bedtime tales meant to protect him from the truth. But now, in the heart of the mill, Lucas understood their meaning. With a surge of determination, Lucas whispered the words his grandfather had taught him, words that had seemed harmless in his youth, but now held the weight of generations. The shadows hissed and recoiled, the entity thrashing as the words cut through the darkness like a blade. The toy truck grew hotter in his hand, glowing with an eerie light as it absorbed the entity's power. The mill groaned, the walls shaking as the curse began to unravel. "You think you can stop me?" the entity bellowed, its voice shaking the very foundations of the mill. "I am eternal. I am beyond your control." But Lucas didn't stop. He repeated the words, louder this time, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The shadows writhed and screamed, the air crackling with dark energy as the entity fought back. But it was too late. The ritual was working. The curse was breaking. The entity lashed out one last time, its form surging toward Lucas in a final, desperate attempt to claim him. But as it reached him, the toy truck in his hand erupted with light, blinding and pure, cutting through the darkness like the first rays of dawn. The shadows evaporated, the whispers silenced, and the entity let out a deafening scream as it was torn apart, its form dissolving into nothingness. The mill shuddered, the walls groaning as the darkness was finally banished. The furnace flickered, its flames dimming as the ancient curse that had bound it to the entity crumbled to dust. Lucas fell to his knees, exhausted, the toy truck cooling in his hand as the last remnants of the curse faded away. It was over, but as Lucas stood, the mill now eerily silent, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The entity was gone, but the mill remained. The curse had been broken, but the shadows, the whispers, they were still a part of this place, a part of him. As Lucas stepped outside into the cold night air, he looked back at the mill, its dark silhouette looming against the starless sky. He had won, but the finality of it all fell hollow. The price had been high, and though the entity had been defeated, the darkness had left its mark. Lucas stood in the doorway of the steel mill, the cold night air biting at his skin as he gazed back at the decaying structure. The roar of the furnace had long faded, and the oppressive darkness that had once dominated the place was gone, but the weight of the past still hung heavy in the air. The mill was silent now, yet the stillness was unsettling, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to disturb the uneasy calm. It was over, or at least it should have been, but Lucas couldn't shake the gnawing sense that the nightmare hadn't fully ended. His breath came in shallow, shaky bursts as he took one final step out of the building. He had destroyed the entity that had claimed his grandfather and countless others, had broken the curse that had bound the souls of the lost to this forsaken place. Yet, something about the way the shadows still clung to the edges of the mill, lingering like old memories, filled him with dread. It was as though the darkness hadn't been entirely vanquished, merely pushed back into the farthest corners of the building, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The toy truck, now cool in his hand, felt like a relic from a life he barely recognized. Once a simple childhood keepsake, it had become the key to ending the curse. But as he stared at it, its surface still faintly glowing from the ritual's aftermath, Lucas wondered if he had truly ended anything at all. A strange, unsettling thought crawled into his mind. What if the curse wasn't broken? What if he had only sealed it deeper within the mill, like his grandfather had tried to do decades before? A gust of wind howled through the trees surrounding the mill, making the rusted doors creak ominously. The sound sent a chill down Lucas's spine, but it wasn't just the wind that unnerved him. It was the whisper, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath his feet. The same whisper that had haunted him within the mill's shadowy depths. It was distant now, but it was still there, lingering like an echo of something that refused to die. For a moment, Lucas considered going back inside, to see if the whispers would grow louder, to confront whatever might still remain. But the thought made his stomach turn, and his feet felt rooted to the ground. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave this place, to turn his back on it forever. He had survived, barely, and pushing his luck any further seemed like inviting disaster. Yet, as he stared at the mill, silhouetted against the dark sky, he knew that some part of him would never truly be free of it. His mind drifted back to his grandfather, the stories he had told, the warnings he had given. Lucas had always thought they were nothing more than old man's tales, meant to scare him as a child. But now, after everything he had witnessed, he realized that his grandfather had been trying to protect him, trying to shield him from the truth. And in the end, Lucas had been dragged into the same nightmare, forced to confront the same malevolent force that had claimed his grandfather's life. But had he really stopped it? The thought gnawed at him as he turned away from the mill and started walking toward his car, parked a short distance away on the overgrown road. His footsteps were heavy, his legs aching with exhaustion, but the weight on his mind was far greater. The whispers might have faded, but their memory clung to him, refusing to be shaken off. The darkness he had fought had left its mark on him, and no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the feeling that it would follow him. As Lucas reached the car, he paused, glancing over his shoulder at the mill one last time. It stood there, silent and imposing, a relic of a past steeped in tragedy and horror. The entity had been banished, the curse broken, or so he hoped. But the shadows that lingered within the mill's crumbling walls seemed to suggest otherwise. They seemed to whisper that the darkness wasn't gone, merely dormant, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a memory surfaced, his grandfather's last words to him, spoken in a voice full of fear and urgency. "It never really goes away, Lucas." At the time, Lucas hadn't understood. Now, standing on the edge of the mill's grounds, he understood all too well. His grandfather had been right. The darkness could be contained, but it could never be truly destroyed. It would always find a way back. Lucas opened the car door and climbed inside, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was safe now, away from the mill's suffocating grasp. But as he drove down the long, desolate road, the sense of unease didn't leave him. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried the faintest hint of a whisper. His mind was playing tricks on him, or at least that's what he told himself. But deep down, he knew the truth. The mill had left a part of itself inside him. The darkness had brushed against his soul, and that mark would never fade. As Lucas drove, the headlights cut through the night, illuminating the twisting, empty road ahead. The further he got from the mill, the quieter the whispers became, but they never truly vanished. They lingered in the back of his mind, like the distant hum of something waiting in the dark, just out of sight. He had escaped the mill, but he would never escape its memory. The mystery of what truly lurked within its walls, of what ancient evil had made its home there, would haunt him forever. And as the mill disappeared in the rearview mirror, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that one day, the darkness would rise again. That one day, it would call for him, or perhaps it would call for someone else. Someone who, like him, would stumble upon that cursed place and be drawn into the nightmare. The shadows were always waiting, and the whispers, they never really stopped.